My tales, believe me, illuminate the night's darkness better than any torch. Few names in medieval chronicles are as shrouded in mysticism and legend as the word assassin. Today, this term has become commonplace, symbolizing a hired killer or a treacherous assailant. However, its origins point to a specific sect that operated in the Middle East from the 10th to the 13th centuries. The mere mention of assassins conjures in my mind images of stealthy warriors in dark robes, moving silently along fortress walls or vanishing into a crowd after a fatal dagger strike. But who were these enigmatic figures in reality? How did this brotherhood come to be? What role did they play in the political and religious conflicts of their time? And why has their memory endured through centuries, becoming overgrown with new myths? This story, as I see it, begins with the actual events. I propose we delve into the era of the Crusades and the confrontations of great empires, when a small group of fanatical Shiite sectarians, the Nizari Ismailis, managed to establish their own state-like entity in the mountains of Persia and Syria. We will trace the life path of Hassan-i Sabbah, the legendary founder of the Order of Assassins, who transformed the mountain fortress of Alamut into a center of fear and admiration. I will find it interesting to examine how the assassins etched their mark on the annals of history through their covert eliminations of rulers, viziers, sultans, and crusaders, as well as what alliances they forged and broke for their own survival. But beyond the dry facts, we will, of course, not overlook the legends. Medieval chroniclers, from both the East and the West, sometimes narrated incredible incidents associated with the assassins. It was claimed that these killers were under the influence of hashish and were enticed by promises of paradisiacal pleasures, and that they were controlled by a mysterious old man of the mountain from a hidden garden of delights. We will examine the testimonies of their contemporaries, from Marco Polo, who revealed the assassins' paradise gardens to Europe, to Persian historians like Al-Juzjani, and the renowned thinker Ibn Khaldun, who sought to comprehend the essence of this sect. Folklore, gossip, and conjectures settled around the assassins, transforming them into semi-legendary figures long before our time. However, the story of the assassins did not end in the 13th century. After the destruction of their fortresses by the Mongols and Mamluks, the image of the assassin did not fade into oblivion. It underwent a transformation and continued its existence in culture. In modern and contemporary times, tales of the assassins inspired writers and scholars, and in the 21st century, they have become heroes of films, series, and, most notably, video games. From early 20th century literary works to the famous Assassin's Creed franchise, we will trace how the perception of assassins has changed, from diabolical fanatics to idealized champions of righteous causes. Today, the assassins are firmly entrenched in the collective consciousness as part of world mythology, and I wish to understand why their story continues to captivate us so strongly. Before embarking on this journey through the centuries, it is important to remember that the assassins were real people, living in a specific time and operating under particular historical conditions. My narrative is an attempt to unite two components: the authentic chronicle of events and the rich layer of legends that has grown upon it. Ultimately, we will gain a panoramic view from the genesis and fall of the secret order of assassins to its astonishing resurgence in our imagination and culture. Prepare for a long journey to the mountains of Persia, the castles of Syria, and then into the virtual worlds of our century. To understand where the assassins came from, I suggest we transport ourselves to the political and religious context of the 11th century. At that time, the Middle East was an arena of confrontation between various dynasties and beliefs within Islam. On one hand, the Abbasid Caliph, the formal leader of the Sunni Islamic world, ruled in Baghdad. However, true power in the Eastern Muslim world had been usurped by the Turkic Seljuk dynasty. Their sultans and all-powerful viziers controlled Persia and the surrounding lands. On the other hand, in Egypt, there existed the rival Fatimid Caliphate, founded by Shiite Ismailis. The Fatimid caliphs claimed their right to spiritual supremacy over all Muslims, yet they professed a specific branch of Islam, Ismailism, which was perceived as heresy by Orthodox Sunnis. The Ismailis, as far as I know, adhered to the belief in a special succession of imams, spiritual leaders who inherited authority from Prophet Muhammad himself through his daughter Fatima and her husband Ali. In the 10th century, the Ismailis spread their doctrines illegally through a network of preachers, and they operated covertly. Hassan became interested in the teaching that promised the formation of a spiritual elite and hidden wisdom, and he became an adherent of the Ismailis. There is a curious legend according to which Hassan-i Sabbah, as a young man, studied alongside two other famous figures of his time, the poet and mathematician Omar Khayyam and the future vizier of the Seljuk Empire, Nizam al-Mulk. According to the story, the three young men made a pact. Whoever among them achieved high status would support the others. Nizam al-Mulk did indeed become an influential statesman at the court of Sultan Malik Shah, and supposedly initially fulfilled his promise by arranging positions for his friends, but Hassan allegedly displayed excessive ambition and acquired detractors at court, after which Nizam al-Mulk was forced to banish him. The offended Hassan vowed revenge. This captivating story, likely invented by later authors, reflects posterity's perception of the rivalry between two mighty intellects of the era, Hassan-i Sabbah and Nizam al-Mulk. In any case, by the mid-1070s, Hassan was indeed forced to leave courtly circles and fully dedicated himself to the cause of Ismailism. Around 1078, Hassan traveled to Egypt itself, to the Fatimid capital of Cairo, to study under leading Ismaili sages and secure support for his mission in Persia. He spent several years at the court of the Fatimid Caliph and gained the trust of influential figures. However, court intrigues caught up with him there as well. For reasons that are not entirely clear, Hassan fell out of favor with Vizier al-Afdal and was forced to leave Cairo. There is a version that Hassan became a supporter of Prince Nizar in the impending succession conflict, which turned part of the court against him. In any event, around 1081, he returned to Persia, filled with determination to establish a Nizari center in his homeland. Having returned to Persia, Hassan-i Sabbah launched vigorous clandestine activities. He traveled through cities and mountainous regions, proclaiming the new Nizari doctrine. In an atmosphere of hostility from the Sunni authorities, they had to operate covertly, forming groups of supporters. Hassan sought a place where his followers could find refuge from persecution while also possessing a strategic advantage. Such a place turned out to be the remote mountain fortress called Alamut, located in the foothills of the Elburz mountain range in northern Persia. The fortress of Alamut stood atop a cliff, almost impregnable to a large army, and controlled a fertile valley. Its name, according to legend, means eagle's nest. In September 1090, Hassan-i Sabbah succeeded in capturing Alamut almost without bloodshed. This happened not by storm, but through cunning and gradual infiltration. Hassan had sent his propagandists to the surrounding areas in advance, who converted local inhabitants and even part of the fortress garrison to their faith. On that momentous day, according to legend, he secretly infiltrated the fortress and presented its lord with an order to vacate Alamut. There is also a tale of a clever deal. Hassan offered the fortress's master a conditional bargain to buy as much land as a buffalo hide could cover. The ruler, taking it as a joke, agreed, and then Hassan ordered the hide to be cut into the thinnest strips and used them to encircle the entire perimeter of the fortress, declaring that it was now bought by him. Perhaps bribery also played a role. It is said that Hassan gave the fortress owner a whole chest of gold as compensation for this rock. In any case, the garrison did not fight against its own men, the majority of whom already sympathized with the preacher. Ultimately, Alamut came under the control of Hassan-i Sabbah. For the Seljuk rulers, this was an exceedingly unpleasant surprise. Right in the heart of their domains, a rebellious fortress had appeared out of nowhere, one that proved not so easy to destroy. Having fortified himself in Alamut, Hassan-i Sabbah began to organize his base. He transformed the fortress into a securely fortified refuge, supplied it with necessary provisions, and began to organize economic activities. Significant attention was paid to education and religious upbringing. Hassan founded a library, collected books, and taught his followers the nuances of Ismaili doctrine. Alamut became something of a fortress monastery, where life was regulated by strict precepts. Hassan himself led an ascetic lifestyle and demanded the same from his entourage, cultivating discipline and unwavering devotion to the cause. The harsh conditions of Alamut are demonstrated by episodes described by historians. One of Hassan's sons was executed on his orders for a breach of discipline, according to different versions, for secretly consuming wine or even suspicion of treason. Hassan showed that the law was the same for everyone, even for members of his family. He did not yet know that he was laying the foundation for a myth. In the coming decades, it was from here, from this eagle's nest, that silent warriors of the shadow would emerge, striking terror into the powerful of this world. Having established themselves in Alamut and other mountain citadels, the Nizari assassins essentially formed their own state within a state. This community possessed its own ideology and a strict internal structure. The faith of the assassins was based on the Ismaili doctrine of the hidden imam, a descendant of Nizar, who was one day to appear to the world. The assassins perceived themselves as a chosen community, dedicated to the true spiritual leader. The assassins themselves used various names for themselves. According to some accounts, Hassan-i Sabbah called his chosen ones by the Arabic word assassiyun, from asas, foundation of faith, meaning people true to the foundations of faith. They called themselves simply believers or fida, from the Arabic fida, ready for self-sacrifice. Their adversaries gave them the derogatory name hashishin, according to one version, from the word hashish, implying that they were supposedly under the influence of drugs. This nickname entered European languages through crusaders and travelers as assassins, meaning murderers, a word that later became a common noun. It is important to understand that in the assassins' own perception, they were not mere murderers or bandits. They saw themselves as warriors of faith, ghazis, waging an unequal sacred struggle against usurpers and infidels. Following the principle of taqiyya, religious dissimulation of their beliefs, the assassins could outwardly pretend to be ordinary Sunnis in order not to reveal their true allegiance. But internally, I believe, they maintained loyalty to the true Imam and his cause. Since open confrontation with the vast Seljuk army was impossible, the assassins chose a tactic of selective strikes, eliminating key opponents, sowing terror and disarray. Every vizier or military commander they killed was intended to show their powerful adversaries that the long arm of retribution would reach them even behind high fortress walls. At the head of the structure stood Hassan-i Sabbah himself, whom contemporaries sometimes called Sheikh al-Jabal, Lord of the Mountain, meaning ruler of the mountain fortress. It was from this that the European image of the old man of the mountain later formed, a mysterious elder commanding fanatics and killers from his mountain refuge. Under Hassan, however, things were much more prosaic. He was not a mystical sorcerer, but a stern leader and a skilled organizer. His closest associates, the da'is or commanders of detachments, were subordinate to him. They managed both the defensive actions of the fortresses and the intelligence and preparation of covert operations in enemy cities. Numerous agents and adherents of the assassins lived under the guise of ordinary citizens among the surrounding Sunni population, often waiting years for an order. Such a network, bound by ideology and personal loyalty to the leader, served as a prototype for secret societies that would later become legendary. The most famous members of the assassin order were the Fidas, the direct executors of eliminations. These were young men raised in a spirit of boundless devotion. They were prepared physically and spiritually, tempering mind and body. The Fidas studied the art of camouflage, silent movement, and skill with the dagger, the assassin's primary weapon. They were taught to speak different languages and dialects so they could infiltrate the victim's entourage disguised as locals. They were taught the art of patiently waiting for the right moment, whether it took months or years. A fundamental principle was the use of cold weapons and the elimination of the target in close combat. This way, the killer could not accidentally harm anyone else and acted with precision. Moreover, this method psychologically intimidated adversaries. If even with all security measures, a high-ranking person could be struck in the heart with a dagger, it sowed panic and mistrust. The Fidais, as a rule, did not seek to escape after completing their mission. On the contrary, they were often prepared to die on the spot, either at the hands of the victim's bodyguards or by committing suicide, just to avoid capture. Such fanaticism astounded contemporaries. As chroniclers noted, neither torture nor the threat of death could make a captured assassin betray his comrades or renounce his mission. This self-sacrifice was rooted in their religious conviction. To die carrying out the leader's orders meant becoming a martyr and gaining a place in paradise. It is said that before a particularly dangerous mission, Fidas received absolution for all sins and guidance from their spiritual mentor, which strengthened their resolve to face death. Their readiness for self-sacrifice made the assassins extremely dangerous adversaries. In essence, they became one of the first organizations in history to employ methods that today would be defined as terrorism or political assassinations. The story of how Hassan-i Sabbah allegedly achieved blind devotion from his men through deception and drugs gained widespread fame in later centuries. This is how Marco Polo describes it. Inside the fortress, he said, was the most beautiful garden, like the one the prophet described for the faithful. All sorts of fruits grew there, and rivers of wine, milk, and honey flowed. Everywhere stood magnificent palaces, inhabited by the most beautiful maidens, capable of singing and playing musical instruments. This place was a paradise, accessible only to the chosen. According to this story, there was a secret garden in Alamut, arranged as a kind of paradise. Unseen fruits grew there, streams of wine and honey flowed, and beautiful maidens entertained the young men and fulfilled their desires. It is claimed that Hassan, using a drink infused with hashish or opium, would plunge chosen young warriors into a deep lethargic sleep and transport them to this luxurious garden. Awakening amidst unseen pleasures, the young men believed they had entered Jannah, the paradise promised to the righteous. After some time, they were again put to sleep and carried out. Awakening within the harsh walls of the fortress, these men were convinced they had experienced heavenly bliss and could return there only if they unconditionally carried out all their master's instructions, even at the cost of their own lives. Thus, legend has it, Hassan formed an army of fanatics, confident that by his will they would immediately enter heaven. How credible is this tale? Modern historians cast doubt on it. Firstly, none of the known Eastern sources contemporary to Hassan-i Sabbah mention any garden of delights in Alamut. This is likely a myth that originated from the tales of the assassins' adversaries and exaggerations by travelers. It is believed that this story was first spread in Western lands by crusaders in the 12th century, and Eastern opponents of the assassins picked it up to discredit the sect. Marco Polo, as far as I know, recorded this legend only at the end of the 13th century, when Alamut itself no longer existed. He heard it secondhand. His account is a later and embellished version. However, the legend proved so vivid that it has endured for centuries. The image of gardens with houris, hashish-intoxicated assassins, and the cunning old man of the mountain formed the basis of many works of art and became firmly rooted in the collective consciousness. But beyond the legends, the assassins also had quite tangible methods of influence. The assassins operated secretly and resourcefully. They knew how to infiltrate their target's circle, becoming servants in the intended victim's house, joining the guard, or becoming confidants. They could wait for years for the opportune moment. At the crucial moment, the assassin would typically draw a concealed dagger and strike, often perishing immediately afterward. However, some operations were also carried out for demonstrative effect. For instance, chronicles recount that one morning, the Seljuk Sultan Sanjar discovered a dagger plunged into his pillow, and beside his bed, a warning note. This seemingly insignificant gesture caused profound shock. It implied that the assassins were capable of infiltrating even the bedchamber of a protected individual and leaving a symbol of their omnipotence. Such psychological attacks sometimes proved successful, compelling adversaries to abandon their plans to attack the sect's mountain fortresses. Another method of influence was the cultivation of an atmosphere of universal suspicion. An enemy of the assassins could never be certain that his entourage was not bribed or infiltrated by the sect's agents. Often, threats themselves had an impact without resorting to physical violence. The combination of actual assassinations and skillfully spread rumors about the omnipresent assassins engendered a persistent fear in the minds of Middle Eastern rulers of that era. Every sudden death or accident could be attributed to the secret activities of the Ismailis. Thus, the assassins, though few in number, achieved an effect disproportionate to their modest resources. They were feared far more than their objective strength warranted. When rumors of the capture of Alamut and the establishment of a rebel stronghold in the heart of Persia reached the Seljuk court, the response was immediate. The powerful vizier Nizam al-Mulk, long aware of the Ismaili heresy, had no intention of tolerating a threat to the Sultanate's unity. He declared Hassan-i Sabbah and his followers enemies of the state and the faith, calling for their extermination. However, before a major punitive expedition could commence, fate played a cruel trick on the vizier himself. On October 14, 1092, Nizam al-Mulk, a long-serving statesman of the Seljuk Empire, was traveling in a palanquin on a road near Nishapur. At the time, the 74-year-old vizier was a renowned scholar, author of the treatise Siyasatnama, a book on statecraft, and the de facto ruler of the state under the young Sultan Malik Shah. The Sultan was in the midst of a military campaign, and the vizier was accompanying the court. Suddenly, an unknown traveler, apparently a Sufi dervish seeking to present a petition to the vizier, approached the procession. The guards, accustomed to Nizam accepting petitions from his subjects, did not prevent his approach. Just as the vizier extended his hand for the letter, a blade flashed. The dervish plunged a dagger into Nizam al-Mulk's heart, inflicting a mortal wound. The attacker attempted to escape but was caught by the guards and killed on the spot. According to other accounts, he took his own life by ingesting poison to avoid capture. Before dying, the vizier managed to ask the assassin's name and heard the reply, "This is the work of Hassan-i Sabbah." Nizam al-Mulk's assassination shook the Seljuk state. The vizier had been a pillar of the throne, and his elimination created a power vacuum. Just a few weeks after this event, Sultan Malik Shah himself also died. Rumors circulated that the Sultan had been poisoned by his wife for her own reasons, but popular gossip could weave everything into a single, dreadful tale. The empire plunged into internecine strife over succession. In this situation, the new sect gained a temporary respite. Terror spread among the populace. If even such a powerful man had fallen victim to a mysterious assassin, then no one could feel safe. As historian B. Lewis later noted, Nizam's death was the first in a series of attacks that, as part of a calculated war of terror, brought sudden death to monarchs, princes, generals, and scholars, all who condemned the Ismaili doctrine and wished for their destruction. The Nizaris demonstrated that they were a force impossible to ignore. In the following years, the followers of Hassan-i Sabbah continued their clandestine war against representatives of the Seljuk authorities. Whenever a new vizier or military commander attempted to organize a military campaign against Alamut, his life was threatened. In 1093, assassins stabbed the governor of Isfahan right during congregational prayer. In 1095, the city governor of Rai was killed. In 1097, one of Sultan Barkiaruk's viziers was assassinated. In 1107, an assassin strike reached Fakhr al-Mulk, son of the late Nizam, and also a vizier, this time under Sultan Barkiaruk. Right in a mosque in the city of Nishapur, an assassin disguised as a petitioner approached the vizier and struck him with a dagger. Thus, the assassins demonstrated that they could reach their enemies even during prayer in a sacred place. Provincial governors, judges, qadis, and military commanders, known for their irreconcilable stance against the Ismaili heresy, often became their targets. Several influential Sunnis were eliminated in Isfahan, Rai, Herat, and other cities. These attacks were often followed by brutal retaliation. The Sunni population, angered by the deaths of their leaders, would carry out pogroms, hunting down and killing suspected Ismailis in the cities. For instance, the inhabitants of Isfahan, upon learning of their ruler's assassination, launched a pogrom in quarters where Ismailis might be hiding, killing many innocent families merely on suspicion. The assassins paid a high price for their tactics. Their community also suffered losses among peaceful sympathizers, but for the sect, it was a war for survival. The Seljuk sultans, in turn, launched military expeditions against the heretics' mountain fortresses. During Hassan-i Sabbah's lifetime, Alamut was surrounded by enemies several times. Some fortresses, such as Lamasar, withstood assaults for several years without being captured. However, the assassins endured every siege. Their fortresses, perched on impregnable cliffs, were difficult to storm. Hassan's followers organized food supplies from surrounding villages and stockpiled everything necessary for a prolonged defense well in advance. The advancing army faced not only physical obstacles, but also an invisible fear. It happened that commanders besieging Alamut would unexpectedly receive mysterious threats or even find that very warning dagger in their tents. Under such conditions, the troops' morale would weaken and campaigns would cease without achieving their objective. One of the most famous episodes of this kind involves the Seljuk Sultan Sanjar, ruler of Khorasan. The young Sanjar undertook a campaign against the Ismailis in the early 12th century. However, as some chroniclers recount, one night he discovered a dagger plunged into the ground beside his bed in his tent, along with a threatening message. Seeing that the assassins had penetrated even to the Sultan himself, he is said to have shuddered. After this incident, Sanjar chose to conclude a peace agreement with the mountaineers. He left them in peace and lifted the siege, demanding in return the recognition of his formal authority and the payment of tribute. This truce suited both sides. The assassins gained a relative respite from attacks, and the Seljuk ruler rid himself of the invisible threat of being stabbed in the middle of the night. While a grueling guerrilla war was being waged in Persia, the Nizari doctrine was also penetrating other regions. Even during Hassan-i Sabbah's lifetime, envoys from Alamut appeared in Syria, Mesopotamia, and even Egypt. In 1106, assassins carried out a daring assassination in distant Syria. In the fortress of Qalat al-Madik Apamea, Emir Khalaf ibn Mulaib, a powerful military commander nominally subordinate to the Fatimids, was stabbed to death. This assassination was likely part of local political intrigues, but the perpetrators were men from the assassin sect, who already inspired fear on Egyptian soil. Sometime later, in 1121, the vizier of the Fatimid Caliphate, Al-Afdal Shahan Shah, the very one who had once expelled Hassan from Cairo, also fell victim to the assassins. So far did the reach of the mountain assassins extend. In Persia itself, by the mid-12th century, the assassin state had gained strength. After the death of Hassan-i Sabbah in 1124, leadership of the order passed to his successors. The new rulers of Alamut were first his closest associate, Kia Buzurg Umid, 1124-1138. Then the latter's son, Muhammad Buzurg Umid, 1138-1162. Under them, the assassins continued to repel Sunni attempts to destroy them. Gradually, an unspoken equilibrium was established. Seljuk rulers grew accustomed to the existence of the rebel fortresses, while the assassins sought not to cross certain boundaries, holding only their territory in the mountains and periodically reminding others of their existence with selective strikes. However, there were also unexpected turns in the history of the assassins. For example, one of Alamut's successors, Hassan II, known as Allah Zikrihi Salam, on his mention be peace, suddenly and publicly proclaimed in 1164 the arrival of the Great Resurrection, Qiyamah, a special spiritual era, in connection with which he abolished the Sharia for his followers. The assassins temporarily departed from the strictness of Islamic norms, interpreting faith in a purely esoteric manner. This step shocked even many of their former adversaries, but it was perhaps an attempt to strengthen the community's internal unity. However, in the early 13th century, the next head of Alamut, Jalal al-Din Hassan, also known as Hassan III, unexpectedly declared his loyalty to the Sunni caliph and even received confirmation of pardon for the Nizaris from the Baghdad court. He formally renounced the heretical practices of his predecessors and restored Sharia norms in his domains, hoping to establish peace with those around him. But this concession did not last long. His successors reverted to their former beliefs, Overall, the assassins' foreign policy remained the same. They were irreconcilable opponents of both their Sunni and Shia neighbors around them. In time, even the Crusaders, strangers to Islamic discords, learned of the existence of this fearsome brotherhood. But we will discuss the assassins' contacts with Europeans in the next chapter. Parallel to the confrontation in Iran, the Nizari movement was taking root in the west, in Syria. In the early 12th century, the Syrian lands of the Middle East were experiencing a period of incessant warfare. The Crusaders, who had seized the coasts, fought against Muslim emirs, and the emirs feuded among themselves no less than with the Franks. In such an environment, the assassins were able to establish themselves, exploiting the disagreements among surrounding rulers. As early as 1106, Ismailis sent from Alamut were actively operating in Syria, attracting new adherents from the local population, especially in mountainous regions. The assassins' first success in Syria was the acquisition of a stronghold in the mountains near the city of Shaizar around 1116. Soon, they established themselves in other fortresses in northwestern Syria, situated on the border between Crusader and Muslim rulers' territories. One of the influential emirs who initially patronized them was Ridwan, the ruler of Aleppo. Seeing the Ismaili fanatics as a useful counterweight to his enemies, he even allowed them to settle in the city. Thus, in 1113, an assassin, or one dispatched by them, stabbed to death Maudud, the powerful Atabeg of Mosul, in a Damascus mosque, just as he had arrived to aid Damascus against the Crusaders. Rumors circulated that Ridwan had secretly facilitated the assassination of his potential rival. In gratitude, he granted the sect refuge in his lands. However, this friendship was short-lived. Ridwan's neighbors, and later his successors, began to oppose the assassin's presence. After Ridwan's death, tolerance gave way to hostility. In 1124, assassins stabbed to death an influential citizen of Aleppo, Qadi ibn al-Khashab, and the townspeople retaliated brutally, massacring all known Ismailis in the city. From then on, there was no place left for the sect in Aleppo. However, by the mid-12th century, the Nizaris had firmly established themselves in the Syrian mountains. Their strongholds included several castles in the Jabal Ansariya region, a mountain range on the Syrian coast, the fortresses of Al-Kaf, Al-Qadmus, Mashyaf, and others. They created a small, autonomous state-like entity, similar to the one in Persia, but interspersed among warring Crusader and Muslim principalities. It was in Syria that Europeans first encountered the phenomenon of the assassins and received first-hand information about them. In the 1160s, a man named Rashid al-Din Sinan rose to lead the Syrian assassins. He had been sent from Alamut as an experienced da'i, but he soon became semi-autonomous and acted quite independently. Sinan established himself in the fortress of Mashyaf, from where he directed his contingents. The fortress of Mashyaf was a small but strong castle, surrounded by a fertile valley. Its thick walls repeatedly withstood sieges. It was he who became known in Europe as the Old Man of the Mountain. This is what the Crusaders called Sinan, translating the Arabic title Sheikh al-Jabal. Sinan's image combined wisdom and cruelty. He became the hero of many legends. It was said that he possessed magical powers and personally directed the assassins' daggers against any target. In reality, Sinan was a skillful tactician and diplomat, maneuvering between more powerful states. Under Sinan, the Syrian assassins entered into open conflict with a new threat, a warlord who was uniting Muslim territories against the Crusaders. This enemy was Sultan Salah al-Din, known in Europe as Saladin. Salah al-Din, having become ruler of Egypt and Syria, intended to eliminate all small autonomous entities that hindered unification, including the assassin sect. In 1175, while besieging Aleppo, Saladin was unexpectedly targeted in an assassination attempt. An assassin rushed from the crowd towards his tent with a dagger and wounded one of his attendants before being killed by the guards. The investigation pointed to the assassins. The Sultan barely escaped and was enraged. The following year, the situation repeated itself. During campaigns in northern Syria, Saladin was again attacked by assassins. This time, the threat loomed directly over the Sultan himself, but he miraculously escaped death thanks to a coat of mail worn under his clothes. Several attackers managed to strike his bodyguards and were cut down by swords. Enraged, Saladin vowed to destroy Masyaf and eradicate this scourge. In the autumn of 1176, his troops besieged the assassins' fortress. However, according to the chronicles, something strange occurred. One night, Saladin awoke to find a dagger lying on his chest in his tent. None of the guards had noticed how unknown individuals had reached the Sultan himself. Some accounts claim that beside the dagger lay a letter from Sinan, threatening death if the Sultan did not retreat. A shaken Saladin realized that even his entire army could not protect him from the invisible hand of the assassins. Soon after, he lifted the siege and entered into negotiations. A truce was concluded between Sinan and Saladin. The assassins ceased their attempts on the Sultan's life, and he, in turn, left their community in peace. The chronicler Ibn al-Athir wrote that Saladin, usually unyielding, was forced to acknowledge the futility of open force in the face of covert terror. European crusader knights initially suffered from the assassins' sudden daggers, but over time, they learned to derive benefit from them. Some Christian rulers entered into secret deals with the assassins. For instance, the Templars, a powerful order of knight monks, compelled the Syrian Ismailis to pay them tribute for peace, according to various accounts, up to 2,000 gold dinars annually. When King Amalric IV of Jerusalem attempted to forge a direct alliance with the assassins in 1173, rumors even emerged of their willingness to accept baptism. This did not sit well with the Templars. A group of knights laid an ambush and killed the old man of the mountain's envoys, thereby thwarting the agreement. Amalric was furious, but the powerful Templar order remained unpunished. From then on, the assassins regarded the Templars as their sworn enemies. However, relations with the Crusaders were ambiguous. Sometimes their interests coincided. Perhaps the most high-profile episode was the assassination of Conrad of Montferrat in 1192. Conrad, who had become ruler of the city of Tyre and was proclaimed King of Jerusalem, was stabbed to death by two men disguised as monks on a city street. This occurred in the midst of the Third Crusade, just a few days after Conrad's election as king. Contemporaries were shocked. The assassins acted in broad daylight and made no attempt to flee. One was torn apart by the mob on the spot. The other was captured. Before his execution, he managed to name King Richard the Lionheart of England as the instigator, which caused an international scandal. Admittedly, Sinan, the head of the assassins, soon denied Richard's involvement through envoys. Richard was even detained in Europe by enemies who accused him of organizing the assassination, and Sinan's letter exonerating the king proved very timely for his release. Sinan claimed that his men had eliminated Conrad due to their own grievances. The true motives for this assassination remain mysterious. Perhaps the assassins were avenging Conrad for his earlier participation, while still a crusader in Constantinople, in a massacre of Ismailis there. Alternatively, Saladin might have secretly eliminated a dangerous adversary with the assassin's help. Whatever the case, Conrad of Montferrat's death went down in history as one of the most notorious contract killings, widely reported by chroniclers of both East and West. Another story concerns the ruler of Tripoli, Count Raymond II, who allegedly became so close to the sect that he entrusted his personal guard to them, but he too fell victim. In 1152, on the streets of Tripoli, several men in burnouses, apparently Muslim Sufis, suddenly attacked the count and inflicted fatal wounds upon him. It turned out they were assassins in disguise. The exact reason is unknown. Some believed Raymond had broken a promise to the sect. Others suspected political rivals. One thing is clear: the assassins made no ultimate distinction between Christians and Muslims if they became a threat or a target of their persecution. Their list of victims included representatives from both sides of the conflict. By the end of the 12th century, the assassins of Syria had become legendary among the Crusaders. Europeans returning from the East told stories back home about the mysterious old man of the mountain and his ruthless killers. Even then, exaggerations circulated, such as the claim that assassins were capable, at a wave of their sheikh's hand, of throwing themselves onto a sword or leaping from a tower to their deaths without regard for their own lives. It was said that a European prince, Count Henry of Champagne, visited Sinan, and Sinan, seeking to impress his guest, ordered 2 young Fidais to leap from the fortress walls to their deaths to demonstrate their unquestioning obedience. These stories are sometimes difficult to separate from legend, but they testify to the fact that the image of the assassins became firmly entrenched in the minds of people from different cultures, evoking both fear and admiration for their fanatical devotion. In the early 13th century, after Sinan's death, he died in 1193, shortly after Salah al-Din, the Syrian assassins continued to exist under the leadership of new da'is appointed from Persia. Their political significance even increased against the backdrop of the Crusaders' weakening and the fragmentation of Muslim lands after Salah al-Din's death. In 1213, the assassins signed a non-aggression pact with the Crusaders of Acre. At times, they were also used by more powerful rulers. Thus, in 1270, on the orders of the Egyptian Sultan Baybars, assassins eliminated one of the Crusader leaders, Philip of Montfort, stabbing him to death near an archery range. But soon after, the era of the assassins came to an end, both in Syria and in Persia. More on this in the next chapter. In the 13th century, a new power descended upon the Middle East, the Mongols. These nomads, united under the banner of Genghis Khan, crushed one state after another. By the middle of the century, their power extended to Persia, where Genghis Khan's grandson, Khan Hulagu, arrived with a formidable army. Hulagu set himself the goal of subjugating all of Iran and Syria, and had no intention of tolerating a hornet's nest in his rear, the independent assassin stronghold. In 1253, he demanded the submission of the Nizari leader. By that time, the assassin order was ruled by Imam Rukn al-Din Kursha, who was young and inexperienced. Realizing the might of the Mongol army, he attempted to negotiate and make concessions. On Kursha's orders, in 1256, several fortresses were surrendered to the Mongols without resistance. However, Alamut, the main citadel, still held out. In the winter of 1256, Hulagu besieged Alamut. After a brief resistance, realizing the hopelessness of the situation, Kursha capitulated. The Mongols entered the famous assassin fortress. According to some accounts, they killed all the defenders. According to others, they spared many, but razed the stronghold itself to the ground. In any case, the order lost the heart of its state. According to the Persian historian Atta Malik Juvaini, who accompanied Hulagu, an extensive library and archives of the assassins were discovered in Alamut. Juvaini, being a devout Sunni, gleefully describes how these books were burned or thrown into the river, considering them heretical. Curiously, the renowned scholar Nasir al-Din al-Tusi was also present at Hulagu's court. He had previously lived in Alamut in the service of the Nizaris, but defected to the Mongols and persuaded the Khan to spare some of the scientific books. Later, al-Tusi participated in the creation of the Great Observatory in Maragay, using the salvaged knowledge. Juvaini, on the other hand, left the first detailed, albeit biased, account of Nizari history. The last Imam ruler, Rukn al-Din Kursha, was sent by Hulagu to the court of the Great Khan in Karakoram. But en route, or shortly after his arrival, he was put to death. Apparently, the Mongols decided to eliminate a potential source for the sect's revival. The fall of Alamut did not immediately mark the complete disappearance of the assassins. For some time, isolated mountain fortresses clung to the old faith, and a portion of the Nizaris fled further east, to Afghanistan and India, escaping Mongol wrath. However, they no longer constituted an organized military force. About a decade after the defeat in Persia, it was the turn of the Syrian assassins. The Mamluk Sultan Baybars, who had expelled the crusaders from most Levantine cities, decided to eliminate this autonomy as well. In 1273, the last Nizari fortresses in the Syrian mountains were captured, their leaders seized, and those deemed undesirable were killed or exiled. The Order of Assassins, as a political and military force, ceased to exist. The very last accounts of assassin military actions date to this same period. In 1271, a memorable incident occurred in Acre. An Eastern assassin, posing as an envoy, stabbed the English Prince Edward, the future King Edward I, with a dagger. He managed to fight off and kill the attacker. Rumors circulated that Sultan Baybars was behind the assassination attempt, having used the services of an assassin to rid himself of a Christian inconvenient to his allies. However, this story remained in the chronicles as the last echo of a once distant and formidable sect. Having disappeared physically, the assassins continued to exist in legends and popular memory. Interestingly, even during the order's existence, numerous half-true rumors circulated about it. We have already mentioned the work of Marco Polo, who, at the end of the 13th century, recounted the myth of the Paradise Garden to Europeans. He was preceded by crusader chroniclers such as William of Tyre and Jacques de Vitry, who were the first to describe the mountain assassins to Western readers. From the East, Persian and Arab historians also sought to understand the phenomenon of the assassins. Thus, another chronicler, Ali ibn al-Athar, detailed the deeds of the assassins in his universal history, each time expressing shock at their audacity. Minhaj al-Din Juzjani, a 13th century chronicler from India, vehemently condemned the Nizaris as godless mulahid heretics, reflecting the orthodox Islamic view. And the thinker Ibn Khaldun, in the 14th century, already philosophically discussed the assassins in his works, citing them as an example of how a religious sect could undermine the foundations of entire kingdoms through the power of ideas and terror. Only a few groups of the assassins' descendants survived. The continuous imamate went underground. It is believed that Nizar's descendants continued the line of imams in secret, and centuries later, it re-emerged in a different form. By the 19th century, the leaders of the Nizari community were known by the title of Aga Khans and had established themselves far from Persia. However, these peaceful communities no longer had a direct connection to the militant order of assassins. By that time, the image of the assassins existed only in the pages of books and in folk epics. Thus, the actual history of the assassins concludes in the Middle Ages, leaving a profound mark. In less than 2 centuries of their existence, from the 1090s to the 1270s, they failed to conquer the world or achieve large-scale political goals, but they managed to etch their name into history forever. Their method of intimidation through selective assassinations proved so unusual for that era that its memory endured for centuries, transforming into legend. And now, having dealt with the facts, we will turn to how the legend of the assassins lived on and changed after their disappearance. The story of the assassins did not end with the Middle Ages, at least not in people's minds. Centuries after the order's disappearance, memories of it continued to inspire scholars, writers, and artists. Gradually, authentic facts mingled with fiction, giving rise to the modern myth of the assassins, cunning killers, a secret society, a hidden order with its own rituals. This myth underwent transformations under the influence of time. In the 18th and 19th centuries, European researchers, fascinated by the mysteries of the East, turned their attention to the stories of the assassins. By then, the word assassin had long entered English, French, and other languages, meaning hired killer, a direct legacy of the Crusaders. Scholars decided to find out who these enigmatic people really were. The French Orientalist Antoine-Isaac Silvestre de Sacy was the first to thoroughly study medieval sources on the hashish in the early 19th century and linked the word to hashish. He suggested that the legend of the assassins' drug-induced intoxication had a linguistic basis. Soon after, the Austrian historian Joseph von Hammer-Purgstall wrote the seminal work, The History of the Assassins, 1818, in which he compiled all available Western and Eastern information. These works reintroduced the assassins to educated Europeans. A romantic image emerged of a mysterious Eastern sect, cruel, yet captivating in its secrecy. Victorian literature also took note, although assassins did not become as frequent protagonists as, say, Egyptian pharaohs or crusader knights. Mentions of them appeared in travelogues and historical novels. The exotic old man of the mountain might appear in the pages to lend a mystical flavor to the plot. Some authors compared contemporary political fanatics to assassins, using the word as a metaphor. Thus, by the early 20th century, assassins were firmly associated in the collective consciousness with the symbol of secret killers acting in the name of faith. A genuine surge of interest in the assassins in fiction occurred in the 20th century. In 1938, the Slovenian writer Vladimir Bartol published the novel Alamut, dedicated to the story of Hassan-i Sabbah and his order. Bartol vividly and meticulously recreated life in the assassin fortress, the training of young fides, the cunning plan involving the Garden of Earthly Delights, and the fanatical devotion of the warriors to their leader. It was in this novel that the famous motto, "Nothing is true, everything is permitted," appeared, often quoted in Russian translation as "Nichto ne istino, pso dozvoleno." In the story, Hassan utters these words, instilling in his followers the idea of freedom from conventional moral constraints in the name of a higher purpose. Interestingly, Bartol imbued the novel not only with historical color, but also with a philosophical subtext, contemplating the nature of totalitarianism. The book was written on the eve of World War II. Alamut remained little known outside Yugoslavia for a long time, but in the second half of the 20th century, it was translated into many languages and became a kind of cult classic for fans of historical adventures. Bartol's novel had a strong influence on the modern image of the assassins. Many scenes and motifs from it, such as the demonstrative suicide of Fides on Hassan's order, or the very idea of creating an earthly paradise to deceive followers, though not historically confirmed, became firmly rooted in popular consciousness. Bartel depicted the assassins as both cruel manipulators and tragic fanatics, setting the tone for many subsequent interpretations. Several decades after Alamut, these interpretations moved into new media, cinema screens and video game monitors. 20th century cinema relatively seldom addressed the theme of assassins directly, but isolated references can be found. In some films about the Crusades or the medieval East, one might see episodic assassin characters, silent, hooded killers. However, a true explosion in the popularity of the assassin image occurred in the 21st century, thanks to the video game industry. In 2007, the first game in the Assassin's Creed series was released, instantly becoming a global hit. Its creators were directly inspired by Nizari history. The game's action unfolded during the Third Crusade. The main character, an assassin named Altair, operated in the Holy Land and even visited the Masyaf fortress, which was transferred into the game as the Brotherhood's base. The game presented the Order of Assassins in a spectacular and romanticized light, as defenders of freedom fighting against the Templar Order, depicted as secret power mongers. The developers borrowed Bartel's motto, "Nothing is true, everything is permitted," as the creed of the assassin order in the game, as well as the legend of the hidden paradise and hashish trials. New details of the myth also emerged. For example, the signature weapon, a hidden blade on the wrist, echoes stories of assassins' daggers smeared with poison. The game's heroes, like the historical Fidais, performed leaps of faith, desperate jumps from towers, demonstrating their readiness to die. Assassin's Creed spawned an entire media franchise. Over a dozen games, comics, novels, and even a film adaptation were released. Each new installment transported the player to a new era, from Renaissance Italy to Victorian England. But at the heart of the plot always remained the conflict between assassins and Templars. Of course, this is a work of fiction. In real history, there was no 1,000-year secret war between the two orders. However, this idea proved extremely attractive. Millions of people became acquainted with the image of the assassin through the lens of the game. A noble killer in a white hood, hiding in the crowd, a master of parkour, eliminating a tyrant with one precise strike of a hidden blade. The assassin's visual style, a stealthy white robe with a red sash, a blade extending from the sleeve, became an icon of modern pop culture. Interestingly, a kind of reassessment of the assassins has occurred in popular culture. While medieval chroniclers depicted their name as a symbol of evil and treachery, modern stories often present assassins sympathetically, almost as fighters against oppression. Of course, reality was far more complex, but the myth of the noble assassin following a code of honor has taken root. Thanks in large part to games and films, many today perceive an assassin more as a kind of Middle Eastern ninja, a master of stealth and blade, rather than a religious fanatic. And so, step by step, the legend evolved. From the dark pages of medieval chronicles, the assassins moved into the ranks of adventure story heroes. In our time, the term assassin has become a cultural code. It appears in album titles, sports team names, and countless internet memes. Few people consider that this word once had a very specific ethnic and religious affiliation. The image detached from its historical roots and became an archetype, a secret, hooded killer, acting according to their own hidden plan. Thus, assassins are immortal, not in a physical, but in a cultural sense. Their story, having survived centuries, continues to be told again and again, each time acquiring new details depending on what society wants to see in it. We have traveled a long way from the mountain fortresses of Persia and Syria to modern screens and books. The history of the assassins is an amazing example of how reality can be reborn as myth. There was a small sect desperately fighting for its survival and faith through terror. Its actual influence on medieval politics was tangible, but not all-encompassing. However, the memory of it proved tenacious. The deeds of the assassins are remembered more vividly than the deeds of many empires. In subsequent eras, people endowed the assassins with new meanings, seeing them sometimes as spawns of hell, sometimes as romantic avengers. Ultimately, the assassins became part of the pantheon of cultural icons, alongside knights, pyramids, and samurai. Their name is instantly recognizable today, even if the true story is sometimes lost in the mists of legend. The history of the assassins is both a warning and an inspiration. It reminds us how fanaticism can breed terror and how fear of an unseen enemy can influence an entire kingdom. But it also demonstrates the power of legend, how ideas and stories outlive their creators. The assassins are gone, but their ghosts still roam among us, in books, films, and games. And perhaps they will continue to roam for a long time, as long as humanity feeds on stories of secret conspiracies, boundless faith, and the freedom to do the impossible in the name of its ideals.